tobacco. Now, welcome aboard, folks. We're just having a little pre-show conversation. Tim, my great-grandfather was a farmer on my mom's side. He was also a school teacher back in the day when they had a one-room school.
Yes, sir.
And because of the small town that he lived in Lyons, Georgia, he was also the county principal. So my grandfather was in his class in a one-room classroom, and his dad was the teacher and the principal. But he was a farmer.
Right.
And they farmed tobacco. And they also raised pigs. I think they had corn, but primarily tobacco. And I was talking to my mom the other day. She said, yeah, your great-granddaddy, her granddad, used to smoke a cigar sometimes out on the porch. I said, he smoked a cigar? He said, yeah, he smoked a cigar. But I'm sure that tobacco they had then is a lot different than today. And I've been hearing reports on Instagram by this one chiropractor doctor. He says you put a nicotine patch on if anybody out there is suffering from some extended flu, and it's supposed to do wonders. That's interesting. I'd like to get my hands on some of that, put it in my medicine box.
Yep. Yes, sir. I've heard a similar recommendation, Shannon. So, yeah.
I was sick for 4 weeks with some kind of recurrent cough, and it almost kicked my butt. But praise the Lord, I recovered. But the kids had that plus fever, so there's something going on down here. I saw a lot of people with masks here in Bali. It's just probably the yearly flu. I don't know, but it seemed to be getting stronger and stronger. So what do you fight back with? They had to go on antibiotics, and that's not good in long-term antibiotics. I've had them enough in my lifetime.
Same here.
Okay, well, we're going to get started. And Tim, I got some buffer time, so you got all the time you want.
Okay.
We are live tonight with researcher Tim Kise. And really, Tim, you've got enough research done. You could probably write a whole series of books.
Absolutely.
And how do you keep all your records? You put them on Microsoft Word?
Well,
print them out? What do you do?
Well, Word is my primary writing tool. But I've got, as a matter of fact, I spent the day yesterday downloading or uploading, whatever the right term is, all of my files to external hard drives and the cloud to back up everything, because I don't want to lose, I don't want to lose this information, because this is, 40 years worth of research. Plus, wow. I learn, Shannon, I learn new stuff every day. I got something new I want to share with you and your audience today that I literally learned within the past 7 days, and it changed my understanding of a very common Bible question that everybody asks, right? And it's in my field, which is the Nativity, right? But yes. It's stunning, Shannon, just how good the Lord is to just keep this fresh always. It's just always, always, always fresh. So I've got
That's amazing.
Some fun little insights that I just gleaned that are really, really fun. And it's in light of the book, because I am writing a book. We have mentioned this several times.
Yes.
The intention of the book, very simple. I don't know if we've ever actually talked about what I'm planning as far as the book is concerned.
No.
Number one, the book is as an accurate a representation of the Nativity as I can manage, right? Now, that's, like I said, that's based on 40 years of research, and it's based upon the foundational understanding that the traditional Nativity story that we are all used to is only accurate in the broadest sense. When you get into the details, the traditional Nativity story, frankly, it just starts to fall apart. It's, things like the fact that the Magi did not arrive the same night as the shepherds, the same night he was born. They arrived later. So that's just one example of a detail that we miss. Or you and I have talked about the fact that he wasn't born in a stable. That's not accurate. Jesus was born in a traditional Judean home, surrounded by loving family. He was not born in a stable surrounded by animals and strangers. That wasn't how it went down. And so on one hand, I'm trying to write the story as accurately as possible. But the second thing I'm doing is this was the Lord showed me this directly, and then it was confirmed by a prophetic word from a good friend of ours,
Yes.
Dr. Dale Sides, who said, Tim, you need to write a book about the Magi's journey from their their homeland, wherever that was, right, to
Yes.
Bethlehem, and then to Jerusalem, and then Bethlehem, right? So the idea here is that I have invented a fictitious character, right, who is as historically and biblically accurate as possible, right? But he's fictitious, okay? And he is going to see the star, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. And then
Oh,
he
yes.
goes on this journey, right? And
Yes.
so that's the story. It's good. It's going to read like an historical novel. That's the intention, right? So you're going to follow this guy on his journey to meet
Oh,
the Christ child. That's the point.
this is exciting. And I'm going to cut Tim loose here in just a moment to reveal something in this program that has only been discovered in the last 7 days. Fresh material. But I want to go back just a moment, 5 minutes or so, and say, how did you get started on this journey, Tim? 40 years ago. You don't look to
Yeah.
be more than 45 years old. How old are you, by the way?
Well, I appreciate that, Shannon. I appreciate that a lot. Well, what it was when I was in Bible college.
Yes.
And when I was in Bible college, there was a book that got recommended, and it burned through our classes. It wasn't required reading for the for the program. It was just
Yes.
a book that got recommended, and that book is called, let's see, let me make sure I get it straight, because the author changed the title. The original title was The Birth of Christ Recalculated. That was the original title of the book. And the author's name is Ernest Martin. And he published that in 78 or 79, 1978, 79, 1980, right in there was when he
Yes.
published The Birth of Christ Recalculated. And I read it in about 85. Okay. Then he reworked it and then republished it, I think, in 1990. And it's now called The Star That Astonished the World.
Wow.
And if this is, now I've learned more. Okay. Frankly, I don't know if Dr. Martin is still with us. I think he may have passed by now, but he was working with a really interesting crew of people. As I delved into this, I figured out who he was working with and stuff like that. He was based out of Pasadena, California, and he was actually working with a chronologer, and then he was also working with the Griffith Celestial Observatory in Los Angeles, right?
Right.
Now, I lived in Los Angeles for 20 years, and that was my stomping grounds, was Pasadena and Griffith and stuff like that. Whenever friends would come visit, I would take them to Griffith.
Yes.
Because this would have been in the 1970s. They were doing shows in the solarium there based on Dr. Martin's work and showing what they believed was what the wise men, what the Magi saw. Now, there's been new information since then, and frankly, I think I know something that Dr. Martin didn't, which is pretty interesting. But it's because there's been progress. I mean, that was 1990. Come on, that's
Sure.
that's 35 years ago. That's a long time. So that was when I got started. I got started in the mid 80s. In, like I said, in Bible college, just because there was this really popular book and it grabbed my attention. My older brother, Dan, who is now passed, was in the same Bible college, read the same book, right?
Yes.
And he was inspired by the book. My brother Dan was a playwright. So he actually got commissioned to write several dramatic productions about the ministry of Jesus Christ, of course, starting with his birth. And that was what he was going to start with, was telling the birth of Jesus from a new perspective based upon this book. And he and I used to trade ideas all the time, et cetera, et cetera. Well, long story short, he did produce one production, and then unfortunately it kind of fell apart at that point. But I grabbed onto it, pardon me, just as a research project, because I just loved the subject matter so much. And I've been going into it ever since. And here's the key. Here's the key. When my brother and I used to kick this around and trade ideas, part of what we were wrestling with, especially him, because he was writing these plays, right, was how do we tell a story that everybody thinks they know, but they don't? Okay, because what we think is Joseph and Mary on the back of a donkey. They arrive in Bethlehem. There's no room in the local motel. The night manager says, well, you can squat in the stable if you want, and then
Right.
she gives birth, and then the shepherds show up, and then the wise men show up, and everybody sings glory to God in the highest. And there you go. That's your traditional children's church or school nativity play. And I'm not trying to mock it. That's not my intention. But it has taken on a life of its own in the past, frankly, 1,000 years since the idea of a nativity play got started. And
Yes.
we are just so familiar with it. Okay. We are just so familiar with it that we blow past the details that actually make this a really, truly stunning and frankly epic story. I mean, the stuff that I have learned. And so what my brother did as a playwright is he said, well, here's what we do. We tell the story through the eyes of a historical character, right? We tell the story through the eyes of the Roman Empire. What did the Roman Empire think about all this? So that was one perspective. Or what if we tell the story through the eyes of the shepherds, right? Or what about through the eyes, here you go, through the eyes of the wise men, through the eyes of the Magi? What would their experience have been? What would they have been thinking, et cetera, right? So he was chasing that down with the intention of doing it, like I said, as a play, right? But I grabbed onto it as a research tool. I went, oh my God, that's perfect. So when you go to my website, www.godsavetheking.org, you will see what are called the Chronicles, and which turns out to be a very accurate title based on the time. I just chose it because it sounded cool. Turns out it's incredibly accurate. And I have what's called the Roman Chronicle, the Parthian Chronicle, and then the Judean Chronicle. So each one of those is the historical background from the three major players in the nativity story to inform you what it was like looking at it through their eyes, right? In Rome, you had the Roman imperial cult that thought Augustus Caesar, was a god, right? And his title, when you run it out in Latin, it includes the words Divi Filius, which literally means son of God. Okay? So that's his title was Imperator Octavianus Augustus Caesar Divi Filius, which meant Augustus Caesar, the son of God, right?
Right.
And so it's amazing the parallels. I'm going to save that for just a second. The parallels between what was going on in Rome with the emperor of the empire, and yet the king of the universe was being born in this little backwater town in Judea, right? And then part of what we're going to get into today is what about these wise men? Who were they, right? And we have been trying to figure this out for decades and generation, who these guys were, right?
Right.
And I think I've got a pretty accurate take on it, finally, after 40 years.
Oh, this is going to be exciting, folks.
Of trying to figure this out. And then another big piece of the puzzle that people are unaware of, unless you research biblical history, you're not going to be aware of this, which is what was going on in Judea. And what was going on in Judea only several decades before Jesus was born is there was a civil war between two Judean princes, two brothers, fighting over the throne of Judea. And it was their civil war that attracted the attention of the Romans. And the Roman general Pompey came in and he conquered Judea, and Judea became a client kingdom of the Romans, right? And it was Pompey who decided between the two brothers, which is really interesting because he actually picked one brother first and then changed his mind and picked the other one.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he picked one, right? And then that brother that he picked, whose name was Aristobulus kind of tried to pull a fast one on Pompey, and Pompey went, He was having none of it. He went, okay, no dice. I'm picking the other brother
Whoa.
whose name was Hyrcanus. So Hyrcanus became the high priest and the de facto king of Judea under the Romans in 63 BC. So that's only 60 years. I mean, I'm 63 years old exactly,
Amazing.
right? So that's the length of time from when the Romans conquered Judea until when Jesus was born, right? Now, I want to play a game with you, Shannon. We actually started
Yes.
this game our last segment, and I didn't get to take it to where I want to go. So
The mic is yours.
I want to keep. Well, you're going to play with me, right?
Okay.
But I want to try to keep it concise because I want to drive you and the listening audience to a point. I want you to grasp a point. Okay. So we're going to play a little Bible trivia, right? Here we go. So the first question is, who wrote the majority of the New Testament? What Bible writer wrote the majority of the New Testament?
I would say Paul.
Okay. Now, so the second trivia question is, how do we know that? How did we arrive at that determination?
Well, just examine all the books there. It seems to be him talking in one of the letters. So I would guess Paul would be my first guess.
Okay, so good. So you gave me exactly the answer I expected. And if you've known me for very long, you'll learn that I set people up. Okay. and I'm not trying to make fun of people, but I want people to think, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the method that we use to arrive at that answer is, well, there's 27 books in the New Testament, and Paul wrote 13 of them. Okay. Or possibly 14.
Okay.
Now, if he wrote 14, then he may have written a true majority of the New Testament, if he indeed wrote 14. That 14th book is very questionable, however, right? But even if you wrote 13, well, then he wrote a ginormous chunk of the New Testament. But that's basing it on the number of books. So let's rephrase the question. If we were to total up the total number of words in the New Testament, and then total up the number of words written by each New Testament writer, who wrote most of the New Testament?
Well, that's a good point. I would say it would be either between Matthew and the book of Revelation.
Okay. It's going to surprise you. It's not Paul. It's not Matthew. It's not John. It's Luke.
Really?
And it's Luke by a chunk. Okay.
Wow. Luke the doctor.
Luke the doctor, right? So Luke wrote, if we stick with our standard understanding of who wrote what, right?
Yeah.
Luke actually wrote about 27% of the New Testament, and Paul wrote about 23% of the New Testament.
What did Luke write? I know.
He wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he wrote the book of Acts.
Oh, okay.
See, and that's what puts him over the top, is the book of Acts, because it's the book of Acts is very lengthy. Okay. Now, so a little more Bible trivia, because this is what I love to stimulate people to do, because when I started God Save the King, it was, like I said, it was with the understanding that, wait a second, this little traditional nativity story isn't as accurate as I would like it to be. So we got to go dig. All right. So that's what we're doing, is we're digging. Right. So what do we know about Luke? What do we know about him from reading the Bible?
He was a physician.
He was a physician. Now, how do we know that?
Paul makes mention of that, right?
Exactly. Paul calls him that, right? So straight out, Paul goes, Luke the physician is with me, right?
Yes.
They were traveling companions for a couple of Paul's journeys, right?
Yes.
What else do we know about him?
What else?
Do we know where he was born?
That's a good question.
Good question.
I don't know.
Okay, don't know. Now, that is the correct answer, is I don't know, because the Bible does not explicitly say. Okay? Now, we can put together some information and make an informed guess. Okay?
Do we know his nationality?
What
Was he Greek or was he Hebrew?
See, that's where we're headed. We're going to answer that in just a moment, right?
Okay.
So, but before we get there, he was a physician. So he was educated.
Yes.
Very educated. And education back then, even more so than now, cost money. So he was from a wealthy family, right?
Yes.
So that's something we know about him. His Greek that he uses in his writings is a very high level Greek. So again, indicating education.
Yes.
Okay. Um, let's see what else. He used medical terminology in his writing. So that just reemphasizes the fact that he was a physician. But
Yes.
let's just go there because you asked the question. We often hear that Luke was a Gentile. Now, this is based on the record in Colossians 4, where Paul calls him the physician. He says, Luke, the physician, is with us. And Paul just got through saying that members of the circumcision are with me. And then he puts in another sentence. And then he says, and Luke, the physician, is also with me. So that makes it look like Luke is not, quote unquote, of the circumcision. So that's where we get this notion that Luke is a Gentile. But we've got to re-examine this phrase of the circumcision, because the same phrase is actually used by Luke in the book of Acts to refer to the Pharisees.
Okay.
That the circumcision is an ultra-zealous party within Judaism, not all of Judaism. Okay?
And when we say zealous, we're not talking heretical. We're talking about people who take the Bible very seriously.
Exactly.
I mean, they study, they read it. These are true Bible scholars, aren't
they?
More than exactly. They're not just the average churchgoer, are they?
No, not at all. So what Paul is saying in Colossians is I have 3 former Pharisees with me.
Yes.
Right? So that's very interesting. Plus Luke, right? Mm-hmm. So let me go back to what I said about, did Paul write most of the books of the New Testament, right? We know he wrote 13 out of 27, and I mentioned there's the possibility he wrote a 14th, right?
Yes.
Well, the 14th one I'm talking about is the book of Hebrews. Oh. And if you study the book of Hebrews at all, you're going to run into the debate of who wrote it.
Who wrote it? Right.
Who wrote it?
Right.
And so Paul is one suggestion, right?
Yeah.
The problem there is we have Paul's other writings. So therefore, when we compare Paul's other writings to the book of Hebrews, the style doesn't really match up. So it throws a little bit of a doubt as to whether it was Paul, right?
Okay.
Another option is Barnabas, right? But the problem there is we don't know for sure that we have anything else that Barnabas wrote. Okay.
Right.
The Epistle of Barnabas is an apocryphal book that may have been written by Barnabas, but we don't know. So now you can't compare the Epistle of Barnabas to Hebrews to conclude that Barnabas wrote it. Still, it's very iffy, right? Another suggestion is Apollos. All right. But same thing there. Apollos didn't write anything else that we know of, so no comparison. But the fourth candidate that we hardly ever talk about, ready, is Luke. And when you compare Hebrews to his other writings, it actually lines up better than anybody else.
So what you're saying is Luke may have written the majority of the New Testament.
Right. So now what that does is it takes and it bumps him from 27% of the New Testament to 33% of the New Testament.
Tim, hold your thought. I got a question I want to insert here.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that each one of them was written to a different audience. Is that true? Like
yes,
Matthew was written to the Jews?
It's part of what we're going to talk about today. You're setting me up, Shannon. You're nailing it, right?
I've been known to take people off on rabbit trails. I don't want to do that today. I want to throw the mic over to you. Take it away, Tim.
Awesome. So back to Luke real quick.
Yes.
So I don't think he was Jewish. Pardon me. I don't think he was a Gentile. I believe he was Jewish, and that he was born in Antioch, which was a Greek-speaking city in the Roman province of Syria. Okay? So he would have been raised culturally as a Greek, which is why his writing comes off that way, right? But ethnically, he was Jewish, because you got to remember, in the book of Romans, we are told that we owe a debt to the Jews to whom belong the oracles of God.
That's right.
And are you trying to tell me that a third of the New Testament was written by a Gentile?
You got a good point there. Do we know what his Hebrew name may have been? Because when I read my King James Bible, I've got all these English names:
Right. Well,
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
that's part of the riddle. The
Oh,
great question. That's absolutely part of the riddle because Luke doesn't have a Hebrew equivalent. It's a Greek name.
oh, interesting.
Right. So, but if he was because think about it, and this is what I'm here to provide is this historical context. He was raised in the provincial capital, a Greek speaking provincial capital of the Roman Empire. Okay. So when he traveled with Paul, now Paul, okay, super quick and come right back. Paul was also raised in the Greek speaking provincial capital of a Roman province. He was from Tarsus, which was the capital of the Roman province of Cilicia.
Okay.
Okay. So now these two guys, this is really important because now from understanding who they were, okay, it helps us understand what they were doing. Okay. Because Paul was absolutely Jewish. He was absolutely a Hebrew. He was a Pharisee, a Hebrew of the Hebrews. He had an extraordinary Hebrew education, but based upon where he was raised, he also would have had an extraordinary Greek education. So Paul would have spoken Aramaic and Greek, possibly Hebrew, okay, which is slightly different than Aramaic. And
Sure.
but because he was raised in a Roman province, he was actually a Roman citizen. We know that from Scripture, right? That's Paul. But he traveled with Luke, who spoke Greek for sure, probably spoke Aramaic because he was an educated man. And he's also from a provincial capital of the Roman Empire. So although he was not a Roman citizen, okay, he was a Roman subject. He was a Roman provincial, right? So now when you read the book of Acts and the epistles of Paul, you read the writings of both Paul and Luke, you can tell that their primary audience is Greek-speaking people living in Roman provinces of Asia, or what we would call Turkey, modern Turkey, right?
Okay.
So, for example, when Luke describes geophysical locations in Asia Minor, he doesn't go into great description. But when he describes geophysical locations in Judea, he does. What does that tell you?
More familiarity with the latter?
Well, it tells you what his audience is familiar with and what they're not.
Okay.
Because when you're writing to a specific audience, you don't need to explain what they already know. So if he's writing to people, Greek-speaking Roman provincials living in Asia Minor, he doesn't have to describe the location. They know the location. But if he's talking about events in Jerusalem to that audience, now he has to explain himself. He's got to describe what he's seeing because they don't understand it. So he has to say, well, this and this and that and this and describe it to them. So that's my point that I'm getting at, because now we're going to switch gears to your other question, because this is a principle of biblical interpretation that often gets overlooked. When you're trying to understand a specific verse of Scripture, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is the interpretation that I am considering, right? Would it have made sense to the Bible writer who wrote it and to his intended audience?
Okay.
Because if it doesn't make sense to those two guys, you're not on the right trail. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean it couldn't have an additional symbolic or prophetic meaning. I'm not saying that. It's just that it's a Jewish book. And in Jewish interpretational methodology, there was always a foundational, for lack of a better word, literal meaning, and that all of the more esoteric meanings had to harmonize with that. You couldn't just go off into the ether and start,
Right.
Right. You had to have a firm foundation for what you're looking at. So now we're going to talk about Matthew. Okay, because that was your question. Each gospel was written to a different audience, a different perspective. Okay, um, Luke was clearly written to a Greek perspective. Mark was written to a Roman perspective, and Matthew was written to a Jewish perspective. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about now. I made a little visual aid, and I should be able to screen share it here. Let me see if I can't get this up on the screen for you, Shannon.
Yes. You see
And
the icon at the bottom? Looks like
yep,
a TV screen with a plus. Okay, there
okay.
you go.
So there you go. So this is a map. Okay. Now let me ask you this, Shannon. Can you see my cursor?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what I want to do is I want to explain this map to people, and then we're gonna dive into what it means. Okay. But I want to explain what you're seeing. So the first thing I want you to look at is I want you to look at this straight blue line that goes up this way and then goes up like that. See this straight blue line?
Stand by 1 second. Let me turn something off here. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right, let's try it again. So if you follow my cursor, there's a straight blue line that goes like this and then turns and goes up here.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's the Euphrates River. Okay.
In fact, Tim, can you hit your plus key? Zoom in a little bit on your far right, at the
Right.
bottom, far right.
Yeah, let's do that. Give me one
Oh yeah.
second.
Give me a
Okay.
little. Yeah, that's better. Yes,
All
sir.
right. So if you follow this straight blue line, goes up here, and then turns and goes like this, that is essentially the Euphrates River. Okay. This is important because when we get to talking about the Romans and the Parthians, this vertical line right here was the border between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. Okay. Now, for what it's worth, look at this other blue line here. This blue line here is the Tigris River. Okay. So everything in this triangle between the two rivers is what is known as Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia literally means the land between the rivers. Okay. So that's what defines Mesopotamia is the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. And then it bled over a little bit to either side of the river. It's not like you know, set foot on the on the east bank of the Tigris and you were no longer in Mesopotamia. But that's Euphrates and the Tigris River. Now look at this yellow line that parallels it here. It goes up here and then it curves over and then it drops down here and then it splits. And one part of it goes right through Israel and off over to Egypt. And then the other part goes through Jordan, modern day Jordan, down to here and then down into Saudi Arabia. And then you'll also see over here, you got a yellow line that goes all the way over this way. Okay. So these yellow lines represent the major trade route of that time. There were others, but these are the ones that affect our story, and that's why they're there. So if you see Babylon here, okay, and you wanted to travel from Babylon to Jerusalem, you would not just go straight line here, because this tan circle here represents a desert you would never want to try to cross. Okay. So you wouldn't just strike out straight out through the desert. You wouldn't do that. You would go up and around and you would follow the major trade routes and then you would drop down into Israel over here. Now, for what it's worth, this over here is if you went from Mesopotamia, Babylon, or Ctesiphon, which is the capital of the Parthian Empire, you would go this direction past modern day Tehran and you would get to there's a city here called Merv. And then Merv was a very, very important caravan city that then took the caravans either to the north or the south to avoid the Himalaya mountains and the Gobi Desert to get you all the way to China, right? And we are aware of this. This is a very famous trade route known as the Silk Road. Okay. And this is actually important to our story. Okay. Now, I'm gonna pan back out for a second, Shannon. I know it's small, but you'll see over here I've got Rome circled and I've got North Macedonia circled, and that's for a reason.
Yes.
Now I'm gonna zoom back in, And we're going to do a little bit of Old Testament history. I've tried to do this quick, but this is actually quite important for people to remember, at least the bullet points, right? The Abrahamic covenant, the covenant that God made with Abraham, he promised Abraham a geophysical space. He promised him land. He told him, wherever your foot treads, that's going to be your land. Okay. And then in Genesis 15, God tells him that land will stretch from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Now, I've already mentioned that this blue line is the river Euphrates. It appears, we don't know for absolute certain, but it appears that when God is mentioning the Euphrates in that context, he actually means this northern section here, not so much necessarily this great big diagonal section here. It appears he's primarily referring to this segment of the Euphrates River. And then the river of Egypt, ironically, is actually not the Nile. It's a smaller river that's over here on the edge of the Sinai Peninsula. But the point being is that it's this wedged shape of modern Israel, but then extending all the way up here into Syria. And the reason I mention that is because if you fast forward 1,000 years to David and Solomon, through their conquests, they actually controlled all the way up to this point on the Euphrates was under Israeli or Jewish control. That is when the kingdom of Israel was at its largest geographically and its most prominent physically, militarily, economically, etc., was under Saul, David, and Solomon. Okay. But then what comes next is when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes over. Summarizing this very, very quickly, Rehoboam does a terrible job and the kingdom divides. So now you have the divided kingdom. You've got the northern kingdom of Israel. Rehoboam's rival, whose name was Jeroboam, he takes 10 tribes and he plants a kingdom in the north. And then 2 of the tribes remain in the south under Rehoboam. And you've got these kingdoms now, the kingdom of Judah in the south and the kingdom of Israel in the north. Now, the reason this is important is because the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, went apostate almost immediately. When you read your Old Testament history, you discover that I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I know it's very close, that virtually no king of the northern kingdom was ever called a good king. So they went apostate almost immediately, right? Now, the southern kingdom was a little different. They tended to go good king, bad king, good king, bad king, good king, bad king. Okay. Now we're getting to why this is significant. So follow my cursor again here. So we're gonna fast forward something in the neighborhood of about 200 to 300 years. The dominant empire in the 8th century was the Assyrian Empire. And the reason I didn't use colored blocks is because it would have made this too jumbled and hard to understand. But the Assyrian Empire is all up here. Okay. It's all up here. And their capital was here, Nineveh. Okay. Nineveh, just to give you perspective, is modern Mosul in Iraq. Okay. A city we've all heard of because of the Gulf Wars, right? That's Mosul. The archaeological dig for Nineveh is just outside of Mosul, Iraq. But Nineveh was one of the capitals of the Assyrian Empire, right? But the Assyrian Empire was all up here. Now, notice their power base was up here. But the empire also went down into the Levant because they came in and they captured the northern kingdom. And then they also exerted power down into lower Mesopotamia down here, right? So it's this huge, big, gigantic empire, right? All power base all up here, but extending down into the Levant and extending down into lower Mesopotamia. So when they conquered the northern kingdom, they had a very interesting foreign policy. And their foreign policy was they would take 70, 80, 90% of the population, of the local population, and then they would disperse them to the rest of the empire. And then they would take other local populations from all over their empire, and they would do the same thing. When they conquered them, they dispersed them. They would take 80, 90% of them, and then they would transport them to other parts of the empire. So the Assyrians deliberately transported foreign people, immigrants, into northern Israel. The whole idea being to dilute the ethnic population. The ethnic population would no longer be purely Jewish, and therefore it was less likely that they would rebel. Okay? So and this is where we get the whole concept of a Samaritan, okay? Because Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. So as we fast forward in time and we get to the gospel era and you start reading about Samaritans, this is why Samaritans had the reputation they did, was the distinct possibility that they were not 100% Jewish. Plus, of the ones that maybe were 100% Jewish, right, they actually set up an alternate temple and an alternate form of worship in the northern kingdom. So they were looked upon as apostate by the kingdom of Judah because they had a separate temple and separate worship and all these things. Okay, now, moving forward. So we were in the 8th century. I want to move forward to the 6th century because there was some leaders from down here in southern Mesopotamia that they had a belly full of Assyrian overlordship, and they pushed up this way, right? They fought against the Assyrians, and they eventually conquered the Assyrian Empire. And this is what we know biblically as the Babylonian Empire. Now, a quick little piece of information, a little bit of trivia that's helpful. There had actually been a Babylonian Empire prior to this point. So if you go into academic work, academic history, they will actually call this the Neo-Babylonian Empire, meaning the new Babylonian Empire, to distinguish it from the previous Babylonian Empire. Also, deep southern Mesopotamia was called Chaldea. So a lot of times, because what you're going to see here is we're going to talk about 3, 4, 5 different trading, empires that ruled over this area, right? Well, a lot of times there are semi-repeats of a previous empire. So you have to do something to distinguish it from the previous version of the same empire. This is called Chaldea. So a lot of times the Neo-Babylonian Empire is referred to as the Chaldean dynasty because that's where these rulers came from, was from Chaldea. And we know the primary actor in this would have been Nebuchadnezzar, okay? Nebuchadnezzar was an army in the Chaldean, I said that wrong. He was a general in the Chaldean army, in the Babylonian army, and he was actually in a battle that would have been right in this neighborhood here. It was the final battle to overthrow the Assyrian Empire, which he did, right? And he was up here when he learned that his father back in Babylon had died and that Nebuchadnezzar was now king, right? So he's got to get back to Babylon to secure his kingship, but he decided it was a good idea to drop down over here and conquer Jerusalem before going back to Babylon. So that is what a big chunk of the Old Testament is about. What a lot of the Old Testament prophets are about is what is known as the Babylonian captivity, because the Babylonians had a similar foreign policy to the Assyrians. Now, whereas the Assyrians would transport a giant chunk of the population, the Babylonians did it a little bit differently in that they didn't just take everybody, but they absolutely took the best and the brightest they could. Right? So that's why you have Daniel and Mishael and Azariah, and what's the other one? It's Mishael, Azariah, and I forget the
Abednego?
Well, that's their Babylonian names. I was trying to use their Hebrew names. It's Mishael, Azariah, and something else, but we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Now that's okay because see, that's their Babylonian names, and that's the point. That they were transferred to Babylon where they served in the Babylonian court, and therefore they would have been given Babylonian names, okay? So far, quick review. We had the Assyrian Empire up here, and then you have the Neo-Babylonian Empire comes up this way, and they conquer the Assyrian Empire. So that means now that the Babylonian Empire is all up through here, down through here, and then all the way up through here. This is the Babylonian Empire, and their capital would have been Babylon. Okay, Assyrian capital was Nineveh, Babylonian capital is Babylon, and we know the story about Daniel. I'm just going to summarize it very briefly.
Tim?
Yes, go ahead.
From the chat room, the name is being offered by Sister Jen as Hananiah.
Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. There you go.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That is awesome. And Shannon, you're still seeing me, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Because for some reason, I'm not seeing
I'm
you.
off screen so we can focus on you.
Okay, good. Excellent. So now, just a quick little important point. The Assyrian Empire was up here. Over here would have been a separate empire called the Median Empire. And they only play a very small role in our story, but they play a role nonetheless. So that's why I want to mention them, is you had the Median Empire over here, right? So, but, Daniel and his friends taken captive to Babylon, where here, very important, where they serve in the Babylonian court, okay? Now, at this time, you're looking at the early 6th century BC is what you're looking at. 586 is what we consider to be the final conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. The early 6th century BC, by this time, Mesopotamia had a tradition of elite level celestial observation that was possibly as much as 3,000 years old. And the reason I tell you that is because we actually have a copy of a clay tablet. I believe it's in the British Museum in London. If it's not there, it's in a museum in Berlin. But the tablet itself is from about 700 BC. And the tablet is partially destroyed. It's not broken, but part of it was burned in a fire. So part of it's illegible, but you can read the rest of the tablet. And the tablet records celestial events. Well, when you record celestial events, if they're accurate enough, okay, you can pinpoint the date because you can take a computer and rewind it, so to speak, and look at which astronomical things are being mentioned in the text and match it to it. So the reason I say they may have had celestial observation for as much as 3,000 years is the event that they're describing as a comet strike. And the comet strike, apparently, I think, don't quote me on this, I know where it landed, but if I'm not mistaken, the comet strike came from the southeast over here, and it went this way, and it actually struck in Austria. Okay, so if you talk to your Austrian friends, which I happen to have an Austrian friend, he actually knows all about it. He can tell you the name and say, yeah, it's this valley over here. It's where we had this comet strike 4,000, 5,000 years ago, and it created this valley when it struck the earth, right? But the point being, once again, is they have high level celestial observation that has been going on for centuries, if not millennia, right? So then we know the story that Nebuchadnezzar has these dreams. His wise men cannot interpret the dreams, but Daniel and his friends, they're being trained as court officials because they're educated men. right? And that's what the Babylonians did, is that an educated man is an educated man. You put them to use. You do not ignore them. Yes, they were slaves, but they wouldn't have been sent to work the fields. They would have been put in the court and, made to be scribes and write stuff down and teach the royal family's children or the nobility's children, stuff like that. Because an educated man was a very, very, high level commodity, right? But at any rate, like I said, Nebuchadnezzar's wise men could not interpret the dream. So then, the threat goes out. Well, if the wise men can't interpret my dream, then, we're going to nix all of you, right? Well, because Daniel and his friends fall in that category, they're under the same threat. So we know the answer, that they pray, and they pray to Yahweh, Jehovah, right? And they get the answer to the dream. They go before the king and they present the answer. And as a result, Daniel is made the chief of all the wise men of Babylon. Okay. Now, this is why that's important. Here we go. Back to the map. I mentioned the Assyrian Empire over here. Then the Babylonians come up from the south. So now they control all of this, plus the Levant, plus Mesopotamia, right? And then I said over here was the Median Empire. Now, the Median Empire plays a very small role, but here it is. Within the Median Empire, there was a tribe called the Magians, 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 okay? And that is because the root word Mag, okay, in the language of the time, basically meant priest. It wasn't the word for priest necessarily, but it meant priest, okay? Well, that word Mag, apparently the root word, became a loan word in other languages all throughout this region, right? So when Nebuchadnezzar appointed Daniel the chief of all the wise men of Babylon, his title was Rab Mag, okay? Rab, which means chief or head in Aramaic, and then Mag, which was the loan word, right? So he became the chief priest, or the leader of all the wise men of Babylon, right? Which would have included all of the celestial observers. He would have been in charge of them. Now, we don't know much about their interaction other than, well, that would have been Daniel's job. But what we do know about the celestial observers is a big part of their job based on the Babylonian religion, right? Which we know, Daniel and his friends refused to participate in. But based upon the Babylonian religion, it was, the word would be omen oriented. They believed in omens. They believed that the gods spoke through various kinds of omens, only one of which was reading the stars. The weather was considered omens. The flight of birds was considered omens. All kinds of things were considered omens. But what the wise men would do, and dreams, obviously, dreams were considered omens. So what the wise men would do is they would give the king of the empire a daily intelligence briefing based upon all of these omens. They would consult all of these omen texts and say, well, the stars say this, and the weather says this, and the birds say this, and this says this, and that says this. So, oh, great king, God save the king. This is what we believe the king should do based upon the omens, right? So Daniel became the head of all the wise men of Babylon, and he would have overseen that for the next, oh my word, it's like 70 years, because we know when the next empire comes in, right? He actually was still alive and had this incredible reputation when the Persians took over before he died, that he transmitted certain information to the Persians. So that gets us to our next empire. Now, Persia is over here. This is where Persia is geophysically. So they came in this direction, and they attacked Babylon, right? Now, this is Daniel chapter 5 in our Bible. When the Persians conquer Babylon, they went in, they actually dammed the Euphrates River north of the city to get the river level to go down so that they could go in under the walls, is what they did. Because to conquer Babylon, to try to go through or over the walls, would have been essentially impossible. But they conquered Babylon, quote unquote, without firing a shot, right? And so now the Persians are the dominant empire, and the Persian Empire, so now they inherit all this as well, right? Because the Babylonians inherited the Assyrian stuff. Now the Persians inherit the Babylonian stuff, which includes the Assyrian stuff. Plus now they're extending all the way over to this kind of boundary over here, right? Now the Persians went a little bit crazy, and they attacked all through Asia Minor over to here. They crossed the Hellespont right here and actually got into Greece, into northern Greece. If you've ever heard of, what is it? I'm blanking on it. The 300. Thermopylae. Thermopylae. The Battle of Thermopylae. Thermopylae is up here, right? And that was a battle between the Persians and the Spartans and the Greeks, right? To defend Greece from Persian incursion into the Balkans down here, right? So thankfully, I guess, the Greeks won and then pushed them back, right? But the predominant religion among the Persians, the state religion was a religion called Zoroastrianism, okay? Named after their prophet whose name was Zoroaster. Or if you were to pronounce it in Greek, it was Zarathustra, okay? Now, once again, Zoroastrianism doesn't play, well, it plays a pretty significant role in our story, but not so much that we need to know everything about what they believed or stuff like that. What we do need to know, however, is it became the state religion of the Persian Empire, and they also borrowed the word Mag, okay? So that became their word for priest as well, okay? So if you go onto the internet and see, and this is where we get the word Magi. That's, you can tell where I'm headed. This is the root word for the word Magi. So if you go on the internet and you go to AI and you type in a question and you say, what is a magus? So magus is the singular, M-A-G-U-S, and then magi is the plural, right? But you go to AI and you type in, what is a magus? The answer you're going to get is they're going to say a magus is a Zoroastrian priest. Okay, now that's not wrong, but it's also not the whole story, okay? Because as I have shown you, this is a loan word, okay? You've got the existence of Mag or Magus or Magi in the Median Empire, and then in the Babylonian Empire, and now in the Persian Empire, they're borrowing the same word, okay? Now, what's also very interesting about this is that because, see, their capital was Persepolis, but they inherited Babylon, okay? And the reason this is important to the Bible story is that Cyrus turned to the Jewish population of Babylon because they had been taken captive, okay, by the Babylonians, and said, you can go home if you want, right? And we know that some of them did, but the percentage was extremely small. So this, of course, is what the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are all about, is that a part of the Jewish population of Babylon would have gone back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, right? But what that means is that the majority of the Jewish population of Babylon, they stayed there. They stayed there. They didn't move, right? So that now means you have a significant, due to the Assyrian captivity and then the Babylonian captivity, you now have a significant Jewish population all through here. All through here, you have a huge Jewish population. You also have a big Jewish population in Alexandria, Egypt, by the way. That's also important. So we have gotten up to the Persian Empire, okay? They let the Jews go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. The Zoroastrians, however, and this is going to shock some people because they think they know the answer, the Zoroastrians were not astronomers. That was not their thing. They did not consult the stars, not the way the Babylonians did. Okay. Now, they respected it because, like the Babylonians, theirs was an omen driven dynamic. They would consult omens to determine to how to report to the king, counsel the king, stuff like that. So therefore, they respected the Babylonians because the whole notion of Zoroastrianism was the fight between order and chaos. That's Zoroastrianism in a massively oversimplified nutshell. The conflict, the rivalry between order and chaos. So therefore, this is the reason they respected astronomy, was because when they would speak with the Babylonians and learn what the Babylonians were absolute experts in for several hundred, if not several thousand years, they went, oh my God, the stars are so orderly. See, they would have absolutely respected the order of the stars, and therefore they would have respected the omens that the Babylonians would have reported to them, even though the Zoroastrians themselves did not read the stars. They didn't do that. It was the Babylonians that did that, okay? And that's why this is important, right? So now, the next thing that happens is I mentioned the fact that the Persians actually, penetrated all the way up here over into the Balkans. The Greeks hated the Persians with a passion, could not stand them. And as a matter of fact, the father of Alexander the Great spent his entire lifetime building an army and building the money and the resources and building the, what's the word I want to use, the worldview to attack the Persians and take back a lot of what they consider to be Greek territory, primarily over here in what is known as Asia Minor, right? So that's what happened. So in a nutshell, Alexander, because his father gets assassinated, Alexander becomes king. He crosses the Hellespont and he drives the Persians back. And when he fought the final battles of the Greeks versus the Persians were up here in what would be northern Iraq. But then Alexander continues on to Babylon. He makes Babylon his capital. And then he continues all the way over here, and then all up through here. So I'm going to zoom back in again for a second to show you this. This is the reason I made the map this way, is because Alexander's empire extends from all the way over here, all the way over here. This is India. This is actually, this is Pakistan, modern Pakistan right here. This is actually modern India, and this is the delta of the Indus River. This right here, this is the Indus River. That's the delta of the Indus River right there. So Alexander's empire was enormous all the way to here and then up into Central Asia, up into here, okay? Enormous. But see, the reason I mention this is because the Greeks were astronomers as well. So when they brought their influence into the picture, they would have enhanced Babylonian understanding of astronomy, astronomical observation, and things like that. But Alexander didn't live very long. He died very young. His empire fractured. It got divided between 4 of his generals. Initially, it was 5. One got defeated very quick, making it 4, right? 2 of those generals are the generals that control up here and through here. They don't really affect our story all that much. But the other 2 generals, one, his name is Ptolemy, and he took Egypt. He took this section down here. And the other one's name was Seleucus. And Seleucus had the bulk of Alexander's territory all through here. He's got the bulk of Alexander's territory. It's so big he can't control it. So it begins to fracture very quickly, very, very quickly. Seleucus's empire begins to fall apart. And here we go. Here we go. This is why this is important. One of the first areas that declares their independence from the Seleucid Empire is this area, the purple circle right here. This is the area known as Parthia, okay? And you can tell this is northeastern modern Iran, and then a big chunk of modern Turkmenistan, okay? This was the traditional homeland of the Parthians, and they declared their independence. There was another part of the Seleucid Empire over here that also declared their independence, and that was because they were just so remote that they just couldn't control them. So they Bactria is over here, is what the ancient name would have been. So the Bactrians declared their independence, and the Parthians declared their independence, and then the Parthians began very steadily moving this way. They started very steadily moving west. So by the time you fast forward about 100, 150 years, they have captured Babylon, and they set up their capital at Ctesiphon. Okay, that's the capital of the Parthian Empire, and then they continue to move this way, right? But what's also happening is that the Seleucid Empire is withdrawing, right? So the Seleucid Empire is not gone. It just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And as a result of what happens here, there's actually a new big gorilla on the block over here called Rome. And Rome is moving this way. Parthia is moving this way. And they're both encroaching on the dying Seleucid Empire. The Seleucid Empire is crumbling from pressure from the outside, from the west, from Rome, and from the east, from Parthia. Okay? And that's why it actually took so long before the Romans and the Parthians actually ever butt heads, right? Now, the Parthians made their state religion Zoroastrianism again, okay? See, because the Greeks, their state religion, of course, was the Greek pantheon. You know, the whole thing about, Zeus and Aphrodite and all the Greek gods, that would have been their state religion. But the Parthians, their state religion was Zoroastrianism, okay? But, and this is very important, the Parthian Empire was a multicultural empire. So you had ethnic Parthians, but you still had a lot of Persians, you had a lot of Greeks, and you had a lot of Jews that lived within the Parthian Empire. And the Parthians said, fine, our state religion is Zoroastrianism, but you do not have to worship the way we say. You are free to worship the way you want, which is really interesting because that means the Babylonians that live in Babylon, they're worshiping the way they want. And all the Jews all through this area, they're worshiping the way they want. Okay, not a problem. Okay, so now let's zoom in a little more here. We fast forward. Like I said, Parthia has come from the east, Rome has come from the west. When they finally do meet, the first major battle, I should say, between Rome and Parthia is right in this area here, right about there. When you read about it in history books, it's called Carai, Carhhae, Carai. We recognize it biblically as the city of Haran, okay? And this is where the Parthians and the Romans first had a battle. The Parthians defeated the Romans. It was very embarrassing for the Romans. Very, very, very embarrassing. And their leader, the general, whose name was Crassus, was killed. About 1/3 of the Roman troops were either captured or killed. Okay? So major defeat by the Parthians. The general, his name, if you look at the history books, was Serena or Surenus, Surena or Surenas, Surenus. So he was extraordinarily popular because he handed this stunning defeat to the Romans. Well, unfortunately, he was so popular that the king of the Parthian Empire had him executed. And that was not good. That was not good, because the way the Parthian government worked is the Parthian government was bicameral. And if that's a fancy word that you don't know what it means, it's actually similar to our government right now, or similar to, like British Parliament. It means you had two houses, two groups, two houses, an upper house and then a lower house. So we have the Senate and the Congress. They had, the upper house was the royal family, the royals, okay? And then the lower house was the nobility, the noble families, right? So when the Parthians invaded from over here, right, the dominant tribe was called the Parni, and the dominant family among the Parni was the Arsacids, okay? So all of the kings of the Parthian Empire were of the Arsacid dynasty, okay? But then, so they were the upper house, okay, of the Parthian government. And then the lower house of the Parthian government was all of the noble families. And we have most of their names, but we're not absolutely certain of all of their names. We're certain of a couple, but we're not certain of all of the names, simply because the records aren't that great. But we are sure about a couple of the names. And the most dominant name in the lower house was the tribe of Surin. Okay, so the general that I just mentioned, he was not only the general of the army, he was the leader of the tribe of Surin, and therefore Surin, or Surenus, it became the title of the head of the tribe of Surin. Now, there's a very interesting relationship between the Arsacids and the Surins, okay? Because the Arsacids, they're the upper house, they're the royalty, and then the Surins are one of the families, only one of the families of the nobility, which are the lower house. But the way the Parthian government worked, the lower house chose the king. Okay, so what they did not do is they did not practice consistently what is known as the right of primogeniture. The right of primogeniture was when the king dies, his oldest son becomes king. Now, I should rephrase that, because they tried to, but they just didn't do it consistently. And the reason they didn't do it consistently was because what if the king's oldest son dies, or for whatever reason becomes ineligible to become king? How do you choose the new king? Okay, is it the second son, or is it the king's brother, or what? Well, that was the job of the lower house of the Parthian government, was to select the king. So that's what the nobles did, is the nobles got together and they selected the king, and they said, this is the new king. And then the very unique relationship between the Arsacids and then the Surins is that the house of Surin, they maintained the hereditary right to coronate the king. So you've got this very interesting interconnection between these two tribes, is that you can't have an Arsacid king that hasn't been crowned by the Surin. Okay, but now you just had this major battle between the Romans and the Parthians. Okay, the Romans get defeated. The Parthian general Surenus is hyper popular. He's so popular that the king considers him a threat, so the king executes him. So all hell breaks loose, because now the Arsacids, the royalty, has lost the support and the loyalty of the house of Surin. They don't have it. Okay? So we have to fast forward a little bit. That king, his name is Herodotus, And Herodotus is still king, and he remains king for another about 15, 16 years. But during that time, he decides to invade. In about 40 BC, he invades across the Euphrates, because the Euphrates was already kind of like the de facto border, right? So he invades across the Euphrates this way, and he also drops down this way. And the reason he drops down this way is because of the civil war that I mentioned earlier. The civil war down in Israel or Judea is between two Judean princes fighting over who should be king. It's two brothers. One's name is Hyrcanus and the other's name is Aristobulus. And there's a whole backstory there that's actually critical, but that we'll do another time. And their civil war draws the attention of the Romans, who come down in and they conquer Judea and Jerusalem, and they make Judea a Roman client kingdom, right? That begins in 63 BC. So Judea has actually been a Roman client kingdom for about 23 years. When the Parthians invade, they cross this line and they drop down here. And the reason they're invading is because they've been invited. They have been invited to invade by one of the two brothers, because one brother, Hyrcanus, he is an ally of Rome, and the other brother, Aristobulus, he is an ally of Parthia, and Aristobulus invites the Parthians to invade. So he invites the Parthians to invade. The government of Judea freaks out. One of the members of that government, he's actually the governor of Galilee at the time, is a man named Herod. Herod the Great is the governor of Galilee when the Parthians invade, and he engages in a strategic retreat where he goes to Petra, which is down over here. Because he's looking for help, right? Then he goes to Alexandria because he is actually a personal friend of the Roman general Mark Antony. And then he actually beats feet all the way back to Rome, where he is appointed king of the Jews by Augustus and Mark Antony and the Roman Senate. He is appointed king of the Jews. But this is very interesting, and this is a big part of the story that no one knows. They don't control Judea right now. Right now, Judea is under control of the Parthians. So they give Herod a Roman army, which he's going to combine with his private army back home, and he sails back and lands in Israel, and it takes him 3 years to reconquer all of Israel from the Parthians and drive them back. Okay? And that is how Herod becomes king of the Jews, king of Judea, right? So here we go. Now, all of that is, if you don't know that, you're not going to understand the point that I'm about to make, okay? Because it's just all background information to get you to this point. Go back to what we were talking about with Luke, right? I went to great pains with Luke and a little bit with Paul to demonstrate that who they were influenced how they wrote and who they wrote to. Okay? And then you asked the perfect question. The Gospels are written to a certain audience. Absolutely true. Luke is written to a Greek audience. Mark's written to a Roman audience. And Matthew is written to a Jewish audience. But here's the point, based upon all of this history. The majority of the Jews don't live in Israel. The majority of the Jews live in the Parthian Empire. That's where the majority of the Jews live. Okay. Now you've got Jews in Rome at this point, and you've got a huge Jewish population in Alexandria as well. But the majority of the Jews alive at this time live in the Parthian Empire. So now when we ask the same question about Matthew that we would have asked about Luke, well, Matthew, who are you writing to? Well, I'm writing to the Jews. Now, there's no question he's writing to all Jews, but if the majority of the Jews he's writing to live in the Parthian Empire, just like I said about Luke, when Luke describes certain things, he didn't bother explaining because he didn't need to, because his audience understood. Okay? Same thing with Matthew. When Matthew writes about certain things, he doesn't explain because he doesn't need to explain, because his audience knows what he's talking about. So this helps us understand two of the most discussed verses, two of the most debated ideas in the Nativity story fall under this category, one with Luke and then one with Matthew. And the one with Luke is the census, right? Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 says, in the days of Herod the king, there went out a decree from Augustus Caesar that all the world should be registered. Well, Luke is writing to an audience that lives predominantly here, okay? And yes, he's mentioning the census reaching Israel and Jerusalem, but his audience nonetheless is here. And that audience would have fallen, his audience would have fallen under that same census, that same decree. Therefore, they would have known all about it. He wouldn't have needed to explain it for more than 10 seconds. And as a matter of fact, there are records of the census from this area that help us understand how it affected Israel. Okay, we have pretty clear record of this census in several locations throughout Asia Minor, right? So that's very important in understanding the record in Luke, is that Luke didn't explain it because they already knew what he was talking about. And therefore, if we do historical research in this area, we may get a better understanding of that census, which we have and we do, right? Now, the same thing is true here. Now, the other topic I'm talking about is the other verse that has just been a mystery verse forever, right? Is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. In the days of Herod the king, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the rising, and we have come to worship him. Okay? And the Greek word for wise men is the Greek word magoi, which is their loan word for mag or magus, right? So they're all using this same word. Okay, what started out was the word for priest among the Medians, got borrowed by the Babylonians, got borrowed by the Persians, made it and got borrowed by the Greeks, right? So now when the wise men show up in Jerusalem and Matthew describes it, he says, wise men from the east, magoi, magi from the east, doesn't explain a word. And the reason he doesn't explain a word is because the Jews he were writing to, they mostly lived all through here. They were subjects of the Parthian Empire, which means if they were even remotely familiar with how the Parthians did things, it wouldn't have required an explanation. They would have known. So now, here we go. Let's put it all together. What the heck did what did Matthew mean? What did Matthew mean? What was a wise man? What was a magus? What was a magoi? Okay, well, we've got to go back to the fact what we talked about here was that this is where Parthia originally was. And then when they invaded, they moved this way, right? And then they also captured Babylon, and that their religion was Zoroastrianism. And that their dominant tribe, the royal family, was the Parni tribe, and then the Arsacid family became the kings of Parthia. But they weren't just kings. In Zoroastrianism, they were priest kings. They were part priest, part king. Okay? Now, in addition, I mentioned the second most powerful tribe. That's the tribe of Surin. The tribe of Surin were the ones that coronated the king. But they coronated the king in a Zoroastrian religious ceremony. Therefore, the house of Surin were also priests because it's a religious ceremony. So Zoroastrianism has more than one kind of priest. They have temple priests that serve in the temple, but then they've also got king priests that serve as the king, and then they've also got a noble priesthood that occupies the lower house of their government that chooses and then coronates the king, because it's all under their religion of Zoroastrianism that they've got all these different priests, and the label Magi applies to every single one of them. It is an umbrella term that not only refers to Zoroastrian priests, but it refers to the Zoroastrian king priests, and it also refers to the Zoroastrian lower house of the Parthian nobility that chooses and coronates the king. And here we go. The British scholar George Rawlinson wrote a book in the 19th century about the Parthian Empire. And in that book, here you go, he calls the lower house the house of Magistenes. In other words, the house of the Magi. So this is who the Magi are, right? Now, yes, they acknowledge celestial activity. They were not astronomers themselves, okay? But Babylon was still a very important city. There still would have been Babylonian astronomers alive and well and living in Babylon, and the Zoroastrians would have consulted the Babylonian astronomers about certain things because they respected astronomy, because astronomy was so orderly, and the Zoroastrians were all about order and chaos, right? And that the king would have sought, right, omen interpretation, not only from the Zoroastrian priesthood, but frankly, he probably would have had some Babylonians on his staff, okay, to help interpret the omens to determine how he's going to run the empire, okay? So now here's where the metal really meets the meat here, okay? I mentioned the fact that the Parthian king Herodotus executed the general Suren and lost the loyalty of the house of Suren. 13 years later, they invade. It's his son, Pacorus, who invades, okay? They eventually get pushed back by the Romans and the Judeans. It's during one of those battles that Pacorus gets killed. So Herodotus appoints his second eldest son to be his heir. That heir, his name is Phraates the fourth, okay? Phraates, even though he's been appointed king by his father, he isn't taking any chances. So he murders 30 half-brothers and any of the nobility that is going to get in his way. But here's the weird part. Because it's looked upon as avenging the death of their leader and general Surenus, he now has the loyalty of the house of Suren again. Very, very, very interesting. So they support him. He reigns for 35 years, which is really interesting because both Phraates and Herod became king in 37 BC and reigned until basically 2 BC. Okay? Very, very, very interesting. So he's got the loyalty of the house of Suren. But here's where it all meets the road. Phraates died in 2 BC. And if you put the chronology together, the star or the celestial phenomenon that was actually witnessed, that happened in the middle of the summer of 3 BC. It was the heliacal rising, and we'll do another session, Shannon, on just on the astronomy. But it would have been the heliacal rising of the planet Jupiter in conjunction with the star Regulus in the constellation of Leo. And the reason that's important is because Jupiter was the king planet, Regulus was the king star, Leo is the royal sign, and it was the heliacal rising, which was an extremely significant, extraordinarily significant celestial sign that really would have influenced the omens. Here you go, would have influenced the omens, because if it's the royal planet, the royal star, and the royal sign, well, this is about the king, right? Okay. But then the king dies. What? What do you mean? You have this amazing celestial phenomenon about the king, and then the king dies. Well, let's reinterpret. Okay? Because now the king is dead. Okay? And he was murdered, by the way. He was murdered by his son. And guess what happens again? Because his son murders his father, the son loses the loyalty of the house of Surin. Again, okay? Because they keep murdering each other, right? And it's their job to pick, oh my God, it's their job to pick the new king. So my hypothesis, which I believe is what's going on here, is that it is the lower house of the House of Magistanes, which is dominated by the House of Surin, okay, that it's their job to choose the new king of the realm. See? And then they're going to coronate the new king of the realm. And because they respect astronomy, a Babylonian astronomer in Babylon, who was probably either on or connected to the king's court, saw this sign, and then that sign initiated 15 months of the most unprecedented celestial activity ever in the history of the world. And he would have tracked that 15 months of celestial activity. The king would have been murdered somewhere right in the middle of it. And they advised the House of Surin, hey, but there's this omen about this great king, right? And somewhere along the line, and we don't know exactly how, but we can engage in some speculation here, somehow they determined that this great king was actually born in Judea. Now, it could have been that it was because of Daniel's influence, because Daniel was the chief of the Magi 600 years earlier. So did he leave behind some secret intelligence that they didn't know about? Or it simply could have been because there's such a massive Jewish population that these wise men that served in the court of the king, it's not impossible that those wise men could have included Jews, right? Or that they definitely would have interfaced with each other, because the Jews, here you go, although they would not have embraced the Babylonian religion, so don't get me wrong, it was the Babylonians that were the celestial experts. And the Jewish calendar is celestial based. And even though they would have casually observed the stars for themselves, there was no Sanhedrin in Babylon. The Sanhedrin was in Jerusalem, and it's the Sanhedrin that determines the new moon for the Jewish calendar. Okay? Well, they couldn't wait for a messenger to arrive in Babylon. That would take a month. By the time the new moon had been determined, it would take a month for someone to get there to tell them the new moon had been officially designated by the Sanhedrin. So because they had no Sanhedrin in Babylon, they just relied on the Babylonians. So they'd meet in the marketplace, and they would just ask a tupsar, that's the word for a Babylonian astronomer. They would ask one of the tupsars, they'd meet him in the marketplace, and they would say, so when did you officially designate the new moon? And they'd say, oh, it was yesterday, it was last night, or 2 days ago, or whatever, right? And that would be how the Jews in Babylon would set their calendar, was because they relied on the celestial observation of the Babylonians that were still living there. So what you've got here, and this is what's going into my book, right? What you've got here is you've got this really interesting interface and interconnection between Babylonian astronomers who legitimately could have been called Magi. That's not an illegitimate term for the astronomers themselves, right? But they are interfacing with the house of Surin and the house of Arsaces to determine the new Parthian king. And somewhere along the line, they get a burr under their saddle, pun intended, because this is a horse-dominated culture. It's not a camel culture. It's a horse culture, right? And they decide to go look for this new king in Judea. Now, all that to say, I've never discussed this orange circle over here. This orange circle over here is the homeland of the house of Surin. And look at this. Look at how interesting this is. This is eastern Iran over here. This is a big chunk of Pakistan right here, and a chunk of modern Afghanistan. And, Shannon, I know you're really big on spiritual warfare. There's a reason that this area is now dominated by Islam and the Prince of Persia.
Yes.
And that's to prevent this knowledge from getting out.
Wow.
Because there is actually a temple right up over here where my cursor is.
Yes.
Okay. Which is very close to where we killed Osama bin Laden.
Whoa.
That has archaeological evidence that supports my theory.
Amazing.
That there was it's later than our time. It's about 20 to 50 years later, but there is actually a record of an Indo-Parthian king whose name was Gondopharnes, okay? And according to their tradition over here, Gondopharnes was a descendant of the Magi that visited Jerusalem.
That's pretty amazing.
Right? So the point being is, and now finally, the Surin, the house of Surin, they were, not only did they install the king, they were the royal cavalry. And we know what Cyrenius did, how he defeated the Romans. His army was 50,000 cavalry. And we are told in historical records, written by the Romans, oddly enough, right? There's a historical written by the Romans, so this record would not have been friendly to Cyrenius, okay? That when Cyrenius just traveled around, just kicked around a bit, his entourage that accompanied him, his bodyguard, was 10,000 cavalry.
Whoa.
So the point being is that when the Surin followed this yellow trade route line here and then dropped down into Judea, they would have been traveling with a small army. I estimate that it was anywhere between 5 and 20,000. And even 5,000 would have been a big deal, let alone 10 or 15 or 20,000, right? And that is why when you get to Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, and Matthew has just said, in the days of Herod the king, wise men came from the east, saying, we have seen his star in the rising and have come to worship him. Verse 3 says, and Herod was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him.
Yes.
Well, there's a good reason. It's because there's an army. The Parthian army has once again invaded Israel, so to speak. Now, they've been allowed in because there's actually a peace treaty in effect between Rome and Parthia for the past 20 years, because they wouldn't have been able to do this without a peace treaty. It wouldn't have been possible. But if you follow this trade route and you go through the city of Dura Europa and then the city of Palmyra right here, and then through Damascus and then down to Jerusalem, right? Herod's intelligence network actually would have informed him. He would have known they were coming. It wasn't a surprise. And he would have allowed them through. But the whole point is look at what they say when they get there, because look at what their job is. Their job is to coronate the king. And they are priests that coronate the king, right? And they respect celestial observance, right? And they have learned from the Babylonians about this amazing royal sign that, oh yeah, by the way, is in the constellation of Leo, which is the tribe, which represents the tribe of Judah. See, and it might just be that simple, right? Well, as a matter of fact, it is that simple. We just don't know how the Babylonians or the Parthians came about this exact information, right?
Yes.
But it wouldn't have been difficult, because all it would have taken was to find a clay tablet or to talk to a Jew who lived there. The planet Jupiter in Hebrew is Tzedek, okay? The star Regulus in Hebrew is Melech, okay? And they were in conjunction. Well, if you put Melech and Tzedek together, you get Melchizedek.
Oh, really?
Yes. And it was
interesting.
Yeah, well, very interesting, because now this is, so it's the royal planet and the royal star in the royal constellation, the tribe of Judah, and that name put together, what does Melchizedek mean? It means the king of righteousness.
That's right.
So this sign is the sign of the king of righteousness being born in the tribe of Judah.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
And I ask you because you're the expert on this. There have been some that have asserted that it was not a star, but it was actually a comet. Have you ever heard that theory? And what do you think about that?
I have heard that theory, and comets all throughout antiquity were negative omens.
Okay.
So you can throw that one away just like that. Because
that wouldn't be positive at all.
It would not be positive at all. Yep.
Okay. That's a good answer.
Yep. Plus this one, the one I'm talking about, mathematically, it could have occurred several hundred or thousand years earlier. Okay. But most likely, this was the first time it was ever recorded by human observation.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
With this mathematical, astronomical software that I've heard Brother Dale talk about and you've talked about, and we've got today, all the computer processing power to just figure out everything. Have y'all actually tracked this star back in time?
Oh, yeah.
Can you actually? Now, I want to ask you, do you think this star is will it make an appearance again in the later days?
It's always possible. I mean, so it's the planet Jupiter, right, which is Tzedek, which is the king planet, right?
Okay.
Which, of course, is the largest planet. Makes complete sense. It was considered the king planet by every major empire that did celestial activity. Yes. They considered it the king planet. It wasn't just the Jews. It wasn't just the Babylonians. It was everybody, right?
Okay.
So very interesting that it's got a cross-cultural meaning. Anybody could have looked at it and went, oh, that's the king planet, right? I mentioned that it was the heliacal rising. Do you know what that is?
No, sir.
Okay, so helios is the Greek word for the sun, okay?
Okay.
So a heliacal rising of a planet is that you got the sun and then you got the planet is hidden by the sun, okay? Can't see it. But then due to the different orbits and rotations of the different planets involved, what happens is now it's going to creep out from behind the sun. Okay? So if you go out very early in the morning when it's dark and you're looking at the eastern horizon, you'll see the glow of the sun, okay, start to creep up above the horizon, but the sun is still itself is still well below the horizon, right? And like I said, because of these rotations, there's going to be a time when it's just in the glare of the sun and you just can't see it, period. Right? But day by day, it sneaks out from behind. Here we go, over here. It sneaks out from behind the sun, right? So what you would do as a celestial observer doing the morning observation, right, is you would go out in the morning and you just be watching the horizon and going, okay, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for the planet Jupiter to pop up over the horizon while the sun still remains below the horizon. This planet is going to pop up. And the reason you're going to know is because, for one thing, it's going to be really bright. It's going to be really, really, really bright in the morning atmosphere, right? Plus, see, remember I mentioned that the Babylonians had centuries of elite level celestial observation.
Sure.
So they knew mathematically when it was going to occur. Okay. The problem, quote unquote, is that it required observation to confirm it. You couldn't just state mathematically it's X date. You had to see it. That was the point, because you don't know which day it's going to creep out from behind the sun and go boink, and there it is, right? But as you just indicated, your question was, have we gone back in history? Well, we don't need to. The Babylonians already did it for us.
Okay.
They've got records of the date of the heliacal rising of Jupiter going back 3,000 years before Christ.
That's amazing.
There is a tablet. Ready for this, Shannon? There is a tablet in the British Museum in London. It's about this big. It's about 3 by 4 inches. There's a cuneiform clay tablet. Now, that section of the tablet records about a 20-year period of time, okay? But it's called the Venus Tablet of Amisaduca because it records the heliacal rising of the planet Venus.
Really?
For a 20-year period of time. And by translating and deciphering this little tiny clay tablet, they can go, oh, yeah, it's this 20-year period of time right here.
Okay, well, this is going to be a strange question. Have you ever heard of the Flagstaff stone?
I think you and I have actually talked about it. I've heard the name, but I don't know what it is.
Okay, I won't take too much time on other than say I've got to send you a file.
Mm-hmm.
I had a guy on many years ago named Dr. Jeffrey Goodman.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a book called The Comets of God, and his specialty was archaeology and specifically Sodom and Gomorrah, and God using some comets as part of destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He makes that case. Well, he has a weird dream. Back in the day when he was doing some archaeological digs up in Arizona, and he dreamt that so many feet under the ground he would find a artifact. Fast forward, he's out on the side of this mountain, and they're doing a dig, and they're finding some artifacts, but he had to leave the expedition, and while he's gone, some of his students that were continuing to dig call him up and say, hey, Dr. Goodman, we found something. And they find it at just about the precise number of feet under the ground. It's like 30, 40 feet down. I forget what the number was. And he said, hold it for me. He goes back and checks it out. And this stone, he said it looked like it was wrapped in saran wrap. And it had a diagram on it that was made by human hands. But what the heck is it doing down here under the ground?
Right.
And it's called the Flagstaff stone. And he was trying to do some analysis, but the Bureau of Land Management confiscated it.
Of course.
And they had it in a box for 20 years. But he was able to take some readings and diagrams before, but he wanted to test it for, like, I guess, I don't know, dating, carbon dating, whatever.
Sure.
He only got it out about 10 years ago. He petitioned, and after 2 decades, they finally released it to him. He showed it to a guy who was a student of Einstein, that knew Einstein, and this guy recognized it as some type of celestial drawing that relates to Venus. When you said Venus, I said, I wonder if there's something here. You're talking about a little cuneiform, right?
Yeah, cuneiform tablet.
They got something about that size. And it's got some celestial diagram there that relates to Venus, and that's all I remember. I haven't been able to get contact to him since, but he sent me a copy of this journal because when they finally got it out, they did the study. I don't know if it relates to anything you're doing, but I'm going to send it to you because there may be a match here with Venus.
Understood.
And maybe this is a divine appointment. This research that you've uncovered is so amazing, Tim. Folks, we're live with researcher Tim Kise. And his website, God Save the King. We've got about 7 minutes before this program's over, but I know there's more where this comes from, Tim. I want to ask you something, too. Many years ago, a guy named Michael Rood
I know, Mike.
was doing a presentation, and he said that Daniel, who was taken into captivity, right, had amassed some wealth, and he sent some gifts of frankincense, gold, and myrrh with wise men that delivered it to Jesus. I don't know where he got that from. I have no idea, but I thought, man, that's really crazy. I wonder if there's any...
Shannon, you remember how I started my story about how when I was in Bible college, I was reading a book called The Birth of Christ Recalculated.
Yes,
and
sir.
that was changed, name was changed to The Star That Astonished the World. And that it was going through my Bible college, my class, and then not only my class, but those who had been through that college before me, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes.
One of those men was Michael Rood.
Really?
Yeah. I did not know him personally, but he's got the same background that I do.
That's amazing. I want to tell you something. You've got a great love for the Word of God. Without that, you would not have made it this far. That has fueled your research, and I smiled because I've got just a 0.5% of that just recently that's driving me to do some biblical research, and I'm having such a fun time with it. I'm not a Bible scholar, but I'm taking my Bible and I'm going in and using some Hebrew word tools, and I'm going back and looking up some of the original Hebrew, because I want another level that I'm not getting in my translation English. You know, it's not a salvation doctrine what I'm talking about, but
right.
You know, going back
Agreed.
and digging.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? I stayed up all night working on a particular project, and
Yes,
I had
sir.
such a fun time. And I don't know, I've just got this newfound love to dig, and it's contagious.
Yes, sir.
And once you get started, that has propelled you 40 years into your research. That is amazing. And I know when you find something new like you did tonight, oh, that's exciting. You hit pay dirt, as they say.
Yes, sir. Oh my God, that was literally what you and your audience have heard today is literally the culmination of 40 years of research, because
Wow.
not just me, but all kinds of Bible scholars for a long time have been trying to answer this question: who were the Magi, and how did they know this, and how did they know about gold, frankincense, and myrrh, right?
Yeah.
Now, the irony is that gold, frankincense, and myrrh would have been used in an incense offering in royal courts all through the Middle East. So the components themselves are not necessarily that strange. But what is interesting about it, and that is, I don't, if Mike sent, I didn't know that he wrote in one of his books that, there were Jews that sent a gift. I don't know
where you got that from,
right.
but I just
Well,
thought it was interesting.
It's not that that's not possible. That could be possible. That very well could be possible. But the interesting thing is, I think it's actually more provocative if we ask the question, what if the Jews didn't tell them? Because what showed up was not necessarily Jews. And also, even though, like I said, even though the hypothesis here is that the reason Matthew didn't go into great explanation is because he was writing to a Jewish audience that would have understood the general concept. They would have understood a Parthian army traveling through Mesopotamia. That wouldn't have been a mystery to them at all. Because something else you got to remember is that not only in Babylon, but in cities all through the ancient Near East, the Jews would send their financial gifts to Jerusalem, which means they sent armed caravans traveling through the countryside, taking large quantities of money to Jerusalem. Because like a lot of the skeptics will say, well, yeah, but an army that large, someone would have noticed and would have said something. No, they did it all the time. It was a common occurrence. So why would they write it down? And if you're writing to an audience that was commonplace for, yeah, you wouldn't have mentioned it. But my point being is that the army that showed up, and that's what it was an army, was Parthian nobility whose job it is to coronate the king. And they ride right into the royal court of Herod the Great, and they pop the hatch and they say, where is the legitimate king of the Jews? Because we know you're not him.
You know, he was nervous.
Oh, man.
And
well, he was nearly dead, but yeah, that freaked him out. And that's why I mentioned Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, that we blow right past. We don't even give it a second thought. It says, and Herod was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. I'm sorry, 3 guys on camels and going to freak anybody out.
more to come next time. Tim, give out your contact information. Do you have a running blog where people can follow this work?
Well, you can go to my website. I'm really focusing on the book right now.
Yes.
So what I have actually done is I've actually pulled back from a lot of my public-facing work while I'm trying really hard to get the book out because it was just taking too much time, you know.
Sure.
But nonetheless, my website is www.godsavetheking.org. So you can find links there to articles and all kinds of stuff that I've done. I have a YouTube channel of the same title. Just go to YouTube and search God Save the King, right? Now, I tell people every time when you do that, God Save the King also happens to be the name of the British national anthem. So you're going to get a lot of hits for the British national anthem. You're going to have to look a little bit if you just simply search God Save the King. But if you put in God Save the King Bible or God Save the King Herod or God Save the King Magi or something, mine will pop up and you'll be able to find it that way. I have a Facebook page. I put a lot of little blurbs on Facebook. I make my own memes and I put those up on Facebook. So Facebook, God Save the King. And then if you want to contact me, the best way to do that is through my God Save the King email, which is contact.godsavetheking@gmail.com. So if you actually need contact.godsavetheking@gmail.com.
Okay, I'll put that in the show notes. What shall we title tonight's broadcast for the archive?
The Search for the Magi.
This is going to be available immediately after this program, and I'll send you a copy, Tim. Would you look at your schedule and get me a date for September?
October.
Yeah, wait a minute. It's October.
Yeah,
what
October.
The heck? It's almost October. October, I mean.
Absolutely.
God richly bless you. You did
Yes,
a great job. Great presentation tonight.
Thanks, sir.
Love you, brother. We'll see you soon.
Excellent.
Thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Shannon.
Folks, GodSaveTheKing.org. Go check it out. Thank you, Tim. Folks, we're going to set up for our next show. Coming up next, Dr. Jonathan Hansen. Stand by.